Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this flaskup.com Mr. Pandaria raiding guide. And in this video we're going to be taking a look at the normal mode version of Siegecrafter Blackfuse in the new Siege of Orgrimmar raid. Now in order to complete this fight, you're going to want to take 2 tanks, 2 to 3 healers, and then the remaining a mixture of both melee and ranged DPS. This is actually a pretty fun fight. There's a different mechanic, I guess, in the sense of the conveyor belts that you can see moving around the outside of the room in the video in the background, but we're going to take a look at them later on in the guide. First of all, you should note that throughout the fight, Siegecrafter Blackfuse will periodically spawn in automated shredders. Now these shredders have got 3 abilities that you're going to have to deal with. The first ability is called Reactive Armor, and this will cause the automated shredders to reduce their damage taken by 80%. However, they're also able to become damaged by a rated slash, shockwave missile, detonate, and superheated. These are abilities that we're going to take a look at later on in this guide. The second ability is called Death from Above, and this will cause the automated shredder to propel itself into the air, and then it will slam back into the ground and inflict a very high amount of damage to anyone that's within 15 yards of where he slams into the ground. Now after the shredder has landed, he will become stunned and take 200% additional damage for 5 seconds. Something to keep in mind since he does have the 80% damage reduction. And his third and final ability is called Overload, and this will cause the shredder to periodically cast the Overload ability, which will deal a moderate amount of damage to everyone in the raid, and it will also increase Overload's damage dealt by 30%. So every time he casts this, it will increase its damage by 30%, so the next cast will be more hard hitting, and it's kind of an indication that you need to kill these shredders off fairly fast before he gets to cast Overload too many times. Now Siegecrafter Blackfuse himself has several abilities that you are also going to have to deal with, unfortunately. His first ability is called Launch Sawblade, and this will cause him to throw these saw blades at random players in the raid, and these saw blades will hover in place until they are removed by an activated electromagnet. Again, that's something to do with the assembly line, and we'll look at that later in the guide. Now, if you happen to stand in these saw blades, they will inflict a very high amount of physical damage to any player or automated shredder that comes into contact with it. It will also knock back any players that do come into contact with it, so that's something your tanks do need to keep in mind. If you're able to tank the automated shredder within the saw blades, then they're going to take a lot of damage from it. Blackfuse's next ability is called Protective Frenzy, and whenever one of his creations, so the automated shredders, is destroyed, he'll enter a temporary frenzy and will increase his attack speed by 100% for 10 seconds. That's just something your healers and tanks need to be aware of, and use cooldowns for accordingly. His next ability is a debuff that he will place on the tanks throughout the fight called Electrostatic Charge, and this will cause him to charge his target with electricity and inflict a very high amount of nature damage to them. Now the debuff that it leaves on them will cause them to take increasing damage from Electrostatic Charge by 100%, and also causing them to increase their damage dealt to targets that have got reactive armor on by 200%. Again, that's something to keep in mind for the automated shredders and tanking them. Now this effect can stack up to 10 times, but we got the tanks to just switch when they had 3 stacks of the debuff. What you can do in order to make the first few initial shredders easier to manage is at the start of the fight you get 1 tank to go to the boss, and then before the first shredder spawns he'll get 2 to 3 stacks of the debuff. Even if it's early, then you could just tank switch and then get the tank with the electrostatic charge debuff to go and pick up the automated shredder, and they should be fairly reasonable in killing it, as it will be taking the additional damage. Blackfuse's next ability is called Automatic Repair Beam, and this is this awesome suit that he is wearing. It looks like something out of Terminator or Robocop or something. It's fitted with an automatic repair beam, and if any damaged automated shredders come within 35 yards of Blackfuse, it will automatically heal them for a small percentage of their maximum health every 3 seconds. Fairly easy to deal with this ability. Make sure your tanks are stood 35 yards apart at all times during this fight when they have the shredders and Blackfuse alive. Now his final ability is called Energized Defense Matrix, and if 3 weapons happen to make it through the assembly line and into Blackfuse's assembly machine, the machine becomes overcharged and it will use the excess energy to power his defense systems, which are on his Robocop/Terminator suit. This will grant him 90% reduced damage for 20 seconds. You don't want this to happen, ever. You always want only 2 weapons to go through the assembly line, and we're going to take a look at the assembly line now. Now, the assembly line. This is quite a fun mechanic, and every 45 seconds, Blackfuse will initiate the assembly line, which will cause disassembled weapons to be brought in via the conveyor belts along the northwest side of the room, and they'll then pass through an assembly machine on the northeast wall of the room, and then they will emerge on a completed conveyor belt along the southeast wall of the room. This is where they will attack players from, and we'll talk about the different abilities in a moment. Now, as you can see far away from where I'm standing, we've actually got a blue world marker put up, and this is because players have to use these transport pipes in order to get onto the conveyor belt along the northwest side of the room, where you're able to attack and destroy disassembled weapons. Now, after you've destroyed one weapon, the remaining 2 weapons get a shield placed around them so you can't kill them as well. It's kind of only fair if you're able to kill multiple of them. You'd just send everyone up and the fight would be stupidly easy. I don't know why you'd want to do that. Now, you should also note that at this point you will want to set up 2 groups of DPS players, and for 10 men we're using 2 players in each group, and for 25 men you'll possibly want to use 5 players in each group. And this is because of a debuff that gets placed on players called pattern recognition, and after they've used the transport pipes to reach the conveyor belt, the assembly line will recognise if that player's been on there or not, and it will reject them for a minute. Now, I did mention that the assembly line occurs every 45 seconds, so this is why you need 2 groups, because players with the debuff can only go every other time. You should also note that on the actual conveyor belt, you can probably see these massive lines of fire, and these are called matter purification beams. Now, if a player gets hit by these, they will take a high amount of fire damage, and while they're on the conveyor belt, it is quite hard to heal them due to the positioning of your raid currently. So players that do go on the conveyor belt need to make sure that they aren't getting hit by these at all. There are little gaps in the purification beams in order to allow players to run through if need be. You should use these as you do end up making your way down the conveyor belt. Now, along the conveyor belt that players jump on, you will get disassembled versions of different turrets and magnets and mines that will occur during this raid. You will get disassembled missile turrets, disassembled laser turrets, disassembled electromagnets, and disassembled crawler mines. And if any of these happen to go through the assembly line into the area where he makes them magically work, then they will cast different abilities at your raid. We used a priority system which kind of told us which disassembled mob, I guess it is, we were going to attack, and we always decided to kill the crawler mines because they're a bit of a pain in the arse if they spawn, and you also lose a bit of DPS uptime on the bosses. You have to switch to them to kill them. And if the crawler mines weren't present, we then made sure that the electromagnet went through. Now, you don't always have to let the electromagnet go through. We thought that it was best to let it through every 3rd assembly line or so, as this does help you clear the saw blades from the room, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, if you happen to let one of the missile turrets go through, then the missile turret will gain an ability called Shockwave Missile, and this will launch a drill-tipped shockwave missile into the ground, and this will send a barrage of drills that will ripple out from a specific location, and every time these ripple out, they will then move further out and further out and further out. It's kind of like the Engulfing Flames ability on Ragnaros, as you just need to simply move away from it and then move back to where you were afterwards. If you do get hit by the shockwave missiles, then you will take a very high amount of damage. If you let the disassembled laser turrets go through the assembly line, it will become an assembled laser turret, and this has got one ability called Superheated. Now, the ground that gets hit by the laser turret beam will burn any player or automated shredder who steps on it. So this is a beam that will fixate on a random player, and as the player kites the beam, it will leave a trail of fire behind them. If you happen to get hit by the beam, it will deal a high amount of damage to you, so make sure you don't get hit by it. Consider using movement ability speed increases if need be. You should also note, as I've just mentioned, that you can tank the automated shredders in the fire that is left behind, so this is a benefit for your tanks that are killing them. If you happen to let one of the disassembled electromagnets through the assembly line, then it will obviously become an assembled electromagnet, and these have got one ability called Magnetic Crush. Now, when the magnet goes through, it will begin to pull all of the players that are in the room towards where the electromagnet is, and this inflicts a moderate amount of physical damage every second, which you just have to heal through. Now, as well as pulling players towards the electromagnet, it will also pull any of the saw blades that are currently in the room towards the magnet as well. You need to make sure you're not standing between any saw blades and magnets, because you will take damage from them if they do happen to hit you, and it is quite high damage. This is useful as it gives you a lot more room to kind of position yourselves once all the saw blades have been sucked off into the magnet. So this is why I said that you want to consider letting a magnet through every kind of 3 assembly lines. It just helps you for positioning later on. And finally, the final mob that can go through is a disassembled crawler mine, which will become an assembled crawler mine, and these don't actually stay on the conveyor belt themselves. The crawler mines will leap down from the conveyor belt and fixate on a random player. Now, when a crawler mine reaches its target, it will blow up, casting an ability called Detonate, which inflicts a very high amount of fire damage to anyone that's within 300 yards, and will also knock them in the air. Ideally, you never want Detonate to go off, so you kind of need to kill the crawler mines as soon as they spawn. Now, within the first minute of being alive, the crawler mines are vulnerable to roots, stuns and snares. However, after 1 minute, they are ready to go, which is the name of their ability, which is quite cool. And this means that they are no longer able to be stunned, rooted and snared, and their speed will increase. So effectively, you've got a minute to stun, snare and keep them as controlled as you want and kill them off as fast as you possibly can. Again, as I've already mentioned, we decided that we wanted to kill the crawler mines on the assembly line as many times as we could, because if the crawler mines do spawn, then you have to obviously swap to them, which is less DPS on the boss, and it just extends the fight ever so slightly. So that's going to do it for this Mists of Pandaria raiding guide. If you would like to view a written version of this guide, then you can head on over to flaskup.com or click on the link in the video description below. Alternatively, if you'd like to view any of our other normal mode guides, then feel free to click on the annotations that are currently on screen now. As always, thank you for watching, and if you're interested in future Mists of Pandaria raiding guides, then please do feel free to subscribe to the channel.